something's happened. Something has absolutely happened in this town. There's just too much little crap for something not to have happened. And I'm about had enough of shit town and the things that goes on.
John B. Mclemore lives in Shittown, Alabama. That's the subject line that catches my eye one day in late 2012 while I'm reading through emails that have come into our radio show, This American Life. I am an old-time listener who just recently rediscovered your show, John writes. I live in a crummy little shit town in Alabama called Woodstock. I would like to tell your producers of 2 events that have happened here recently. I would hope you have the facilities to investigate. One of the events, John writes, involves a local police officer with the county sheriff's department. John's heard that a woman has been saying this officer sexually abused her. The guy's still on the force. So, that's one. The other event is a murder of a guy in his early 20s named Dylan Nichols. The murderer, John says, is the son of a prominent local family. His name is Kabram Burt. The Burts are millionaires.
Hello and welcome to Real Crime Profile. This is Jim Clemente, former New York City prosecutor and retired FBI profiler. And with me is...
Laura Richards, criminal behavioral analyst and advocate and author, and also founder and director of Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service.
And I'm Lisa Zambetti. I'm the casting director for Criminal Minds and Criminal Minds Beyond Borders, and I have a real interest in real crime and the minds that solve those crimes and the minds that make podcasts about true crimes or...
There you go.
Something like that. So today we're going to be talking about what everybody's been talking about for the last month, and that's the podcast S-Town, which is a This American Life and serial production. In fact, just on my way over here, I stopped at a stoplight, and the guy next to me had his window down, and he was listening to S-Town. Wow. So it's like, everybody's listening to it. Some are binging it like I did. Some are, taking their time. And so we wanted to talk about it. There's a lot of things to ask about it. I've got a lot of questions for you guys, but there's no doubt that it's been a huge blockbuster. I mean, I think it's been, you told me it was even bigger than Serial, right?
Oh, yeah. They hit the 10 million mark in 4 days, I believe, 10 million downloads. So
but they released all of the 7 together, didn't they?
Yes,
and
they did.
It just went crazy. 10 million is huge.
It's massive, yes.
I couldn't even distinguish, one episode from the other, really. Unlike Serial, where you really had different chapters, I just let this one play through, and I couldn't even tell you, really? What was episode 1 and 4 and all that stuff.
Well, I think it's a very compelling story, and it's interesting. It starts out as a murder mystery, basically. There's an allegation that there's a murder in a small Alabama town, and John Mclemore got in touch with Brian Reed of This American Life and asked him to look into this murder in his town. Not a very happy-go-lucky, nice white picket fence town from John McLemore's description. He calls it Shit Town.
Right. It's S-Town for, PG ratings. But yeah, it's basically he calls it Shit Town. And I wanted to point out that he contacts Brian Reed over and over and over again to the point that, it's almost like he's stalking him. They have quite a back and forth before Brian will take him seriously, which I thought was interesting. You don't know if somebody's a crank or if they really have a story, and it's to
Brian. He shows he was determined and committed.
Yes, or fixated and obsessed.
But yes. Jim and I are going to get into that.
Yeah. You guys are going to profile. You're going to profile John, aren't you?
Yeah, we'll profile them. We'll profile John. We'll profile the town. We'll profile a lot of the characters here, because I think there are a lot of characters involved in this S-Town.
Right. So in the beginning, as you said, Jim, it starts out as a murder mystery where John has this story that he's heard and believes that a wealthy son of the town has gotten away with murdering, another guy. And eventually Brian gets interested enough to go to Alabama and actually do the research and try to find out if this is true.
Yeah. And what he finds is that the allegation is basically that, I guess, starting as sort of a bar fight, that this one guy got beat so badly that he became a paraplegic and that he expired in the hospital, that it was actually a murder that went not only unsolved but completely unresolved, and
maybe covered up
and brushed under the carpet. That was the allegation as well.
He believed that it was brushed under the carpet because the person who did the killing and apparently was bragging to others about killing this guy and getting away with it was a wealthy kid, and that because his family had some wealth and power in the community, that nothing was done.
And set in the context of police corruption and allegations of sexual violence and allegations being made and the police not following it up and some of those officers still being on duty. So that kind of backstory is sewn in right from the start.
Right. So it sounds like a pretty dark place. And there were, as Laura said, a number of different types of allegations that kind of made you think that this is not a nice place to live.
And it's a place that hasn't really had the spotlight on it. Mm-hmm. It's been a place that's been allowed to get away with things, or individuals in authority, but also just people in the township who do bad things, and yet there's no real consequence for their actions.
Right. And I thought in my hearing of this that Brian Reed was actually shocked when he went down there. Like, he was kind of afraid to sort of approach certain people, but then the people that he thought, no way they'll ever talk to me, just walked right up to him and opened wide up about what they heard and knew, and the story came to life right away. I mean, people were not timid at all about talking about the same, like basically reinforcing the same allegations that John had made originally. So he was quite shocked at that, and I thought that's interesting because this is a investigative reporter who is used to doing this, going into places and finding out things about deep, dark secrets, and he was very timid about being down there, and the whole atmosphere in the town seemed to be a little bit, let's say, racially biased. For example,
a little bit.
The lead,
I would say more than a little bit.
The lead lumber company, one of the biggest businesses there, was called the 3Ks, and the owner of that proudly said he did not mind the connection between his company and the KKK. It's of course the three names of the owner's family. They're all K first names, so I think that's why the company was named that. But I think it was also not.
He didn't mind the marketing that it was
not at all
associating it, yeah.
And then there's tattoo artists and biker bars. So it was intimidating for him coming from a place where that's no longer accepted. Going to a place like that was a very intimidating thing.
Not knowing this area at all, but I have read a little bit about it. What do we know about it, just in terms of, have you been there, Lisa?
So I haven't actually stopped there, but I did take a train trip, I think I told you guys before, through Louisiana and around the United States. When you go through Louisiana and you hit Alabama, literally the ground turns red. I mean, it is beautiful. It is like this brick-colored clay, and it's just everywhere. It's just red, and it's got a very kind of jungle, almost tropical feel to it I'm taking the train through, I don't know where.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. And so it's wonderful to do that, to look in to see, what people are doing in their backyards. But I thought it was a very interesting, lush, very poetic looking kind of place where, you see a rusted out barn covered with vines. And so I was really captivated by it.
Well, I don't know if I've ever actually stayed in Alabama, but I have gone through Alabama. And I do remember, though, sort of driving through streets that were very rural, very like covered with trees, like just overhanging the top, like you feel like you're going into a tunnel. It's very dark and very isolating.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
It wasn't at all built up in any way, shape, or form through most of the state. And I do believe that I felt very ill at ease. Just like if your car breaks down in the middle of nowhere, there's no place to go, and I was worried about swamp things coming out, and maybe that's because I grew up in the city and love the city atmosphere, that it's the country that scares me because of the animals and the snakes and the
spiders.
We already know that I am not a fan of spiders.
Granted, John B. Mclemore really sets the stage of this town and sets up Brian for what he's going to he's going to run into. And so then, should we have a spoiler alert? Should we spoil what happens next? I mean, I guess so. If you haven't listened to the podcast, then you might want to skip ahead or listen to this another time. But we're definitely,
before we do that,
Yeah.
I would like to say I did kind of enjoy the setup with the whole clocks, you know, and horology aspect to it. I thought the trailer was very smart, sort of the production side, just around, you know, the ticking clock and the element of time. And obviously that was John's, one of his big passions was about clocks and sundials. So I think on the production side, there's some interesting things that they did. It's very polished as a production as well.
oh yeah.
But we will, yes, and the music, you know, was great. There were so many different aspects to this, to the storytelling of what starts as one story, but actually there are twists and turns that take you down other sort of alleys, some of them blind alleys, but certainly raising some interesting points. But we're going to have to talk about the detail of it. So if you haven't listened to S Town, go and do it first and then tune
come
into
back.
us.
Yes, because we on Real Crime Profile like to get behind the scenes of these cases and not just dance around on the surface that you hear in serial or on any documentary or program on TV. We like to talk about what's really going on behind the scenes. And John Mclemore is an amazing character in terms of behavior. There's a lot of behavior there, and I think we want to drill down and talk about who he is as a person.
And I think that opening sequence of him even talking tells you a huge amount. You know, if you can stay tuned after sort of the various sort of narratives and subjects and this kind of roller coaster ride of topics, which is quite difficult to listen to at first. But, you know, this kind of diatribe where he talks across so many subjects, it doesn't make for easy listening, actually, listening to him at the very start. That was my own personal experience anyway.
Well, yeah, I'm sure you have to deal with his accent. I mean, in the U.S., we had to deal with his accent, which is it was an extreme accent for the U.S., being from Alabama. But he certainly was intelligent, I would say even brilliant, and articulate. But he was also very manic. I mean, he would go off and these tangents that he would go on and the way his brain would try to tie all these things together, I thought that was pretty interesting.
Or sometimes not tie things together.
Yeah,
I could imagine that Brian would have, you know, hundreds of thousands of these phone calls, that wondering where they're going and what to document and what not. And that's a challenge, isn't
Going
it?
on hour after hour.
I was going to say, just think of how many hours, you know, we heard, you know, only 7. He reminded me a little bit of like a Harper Lee meets Scarlett O'Hara meets Foghorn Leghorn. I mean, such a huge personality, and he could just, I mean, to me, I found it fascinating. He'd just talk about anything, and I just loved listening to him. And so this is sort of the first part of this journey before you really know what's going on here.
Right. And I think that when Brian actually arrives there and meets him in person and sees the circumstances under which he's living and meets his mother and sees the house and the disarray and it sort of exactly mirrors how John's communicating with him, probably realized, well, what have I gotten myself into? Mm-hmm. But it's clearly going to be, whatever it is, it's going to be a great story. And I think he was right.
But conversely, he also sees things like the maze and, you know, his detailed work with the clocks, which shows him very different sides to John Mclemore. And I think that's the bit that Jim and I are going to get into. There's the surface stuff that's presented you know, at the start of the narrative, but there's glimpses of someone with many different depths, and those depths, you know, in terms of the things, the choices that he's made, the very clear statements that he makes about looking after his mother, which I really want to get into some of that detail, and that, you know, there are times when he can't speak because he's doing things with his mother, this kind of caring behaviour. And that he takes in lots of animals, the dogs, the waifs and strays, and sort of has this rescue centre that he's created. But on a, it sounds like it's a huge amount of land, isn't it? It's 120 something acres, I believe, that he's situated on, looking after these dogs, looking after his mother, and this brilliance of mind around what was called horology. Which, I mean, some of the terms I hadn't heard before.
I had never heard of it either.
Antiquated horology, I think. And Brian remarked that, you know, this is a whole field that he hadn't understood before or knew nothing about.
Yeah, just the ability to sort of repair these antique clocks, very complicated antique clocks, and not just find some part to fit, but actually create the parts, like re-engineer the parts and make it fit just by sight.
With no manual, nothing to sort of guide or lead, which is why a lot of people spoke about him of his sheer brilliance and mastermind.
And the amount of the brain that would take, not only to have sort of the tactile, what do you call that when you have to do...
Meticulous.
This meticulous thing with your hands, but you have to actually craft something with your hands in a meticulous fashion, but then also calculate the mathematics of it and the engineering. I mean, that's pulling from so many. Most people only use like one part of their brain.
That is brilliant.
They're either a hands-on person or a minds-on person, and he had to pull from all of that.
And I think that, Laura and I both would agree that this was a brilliant person, that his brain was... firing on all cylinders. It's part of mania that your brain can make connections that it doesn't make when you're just on flat affect or depressed. And so it's something that he obviously took advantage of. I mean, he claims, and probably was, self-educated. He never left that town, right? He always lived in that town. And
even though he said he hated it so much. I mean, this is, again, just one of the interesting contradictions of saying how much he didn't like it, but as you said, didn't actually step foot outside of it, didn't have any broader horizon as such, but yet he had such a wide spectrum of topics of conversation and knowledge about so many diverse things.
Right, and, you would think that in the age preceding the internet age, that he probably would have been completely just, stuck in a hole, and he wouldn't have had access to all this information. I don't know what he would have done. But people would bring their clocks, these priceless clocks that needed to be fixed, that nobody else in the world could fix. They'd bring them to him, and he would fix it. And I know that there were some stories of guys who brought clocks to him, and he started ripping everything apart, and they were just panicking. Oh my God, what are you doing? But he was able to put it all back together and fix the parts that were missing or broken. So that's fascinating. Hello, it's Jim Clemente and Francie Hakes with a special message about a new show that I'm hosting on Wondery called Locked Up Abroad. In each episode, people tell their harrowing stories of being convicted of crimes and jailed in foreign lands, or kidnapped and held hostage in war-torn countries.
These are definitely worst-case scenarios. They're truly frightening situations.
Yes, no best cases here.
But it is fascinating to hear how they manage to survive these ordeals.
In the first episode, Midnight Express, Billy Hayes tells us about being imprisoned in Turkey for smuggling hashish. Oliver Stone even made a movie about it. But that was the movie. This is the real story. I even had the chance to interview Billy Hayes recently, and he told me the whole story behind the story of how he escaped a Turkish prison. He even told me that he went back to Turkey years later. You have to hear his story to believe it.
And now, in his own words, here is Billy Hayes.
I'd say it's about this point that I ask myself, is John fucking with me? Is he just a bored guy who contacted me on a lark and never expected me to actually follow through? Is this murder not real and he knows it? It's not only the fact that he is right now pouring potassium cyanide into a bucket in front of me that makes me wonder this.
There you go. Oh shit.
It's all the little moments from our conversations over the months that I've ignored or written off as just one of John's quirks.
Something I appreciate about, Brian Reed's storytelling is here he's showing you such a contradiction, how you have this small little town where you would never think that somebody like this would exist. I just love that you really can't take for granted who is in a town. You just can't. You really have to set your prejudices aside because there's so much more beneath the surface to somebody.
Yeah.
He had an astrolabe and all sorts of things with the sundials, and I thought it was an interesting question that Brian posed. Who do you talk to about all of this stuff? And so, on the surface, it looks quite one-dimensional. This is somebody who's very isolated, who is living his life as sort of a genius with no one around him to share it with. But of course, we start to find out far more as Brian peels away the layers of who John Mclemore really was.
But yeah, I think that he's sort of like a fish out of water in his own pond, you know.
So I thought it was quite interesting. This is a spoiler alert to our listeners, but that Brian goes there, he thinks, to investigate a murder. And I thought it was very interesting right from the start, 'cause it happened very early on that, you know, Brian then starts to reveal there's no record in the library of this murder, and everyone he talks to, he can't seem to find anyone who says in particular that this happened and what time and date and any record of it in particular, and with the police. So that for me was a red flag immediately.
But it also I thought when I was hearing that, well, that's also consistent with a cover-up. So I thought that might be what was going on. But is it?
Well, that's where they want to take you, don't they?
Yeah.
And again, you know, in production, that's exactly, you know, the $1 million question that you want things to end on. If people, is this something swept under the carpet? And actually it's going to take an investigative journalist or a great law enforcement officer to start digging on an independent level. You know, and he comes across these very interesting characters as well. And as you said, Jim, he didn't really want to challenge some of them. You know, and it was Brian the fish that was out of water. And of course, documentarians and people who are going in, normally they have to ask these tough questions, and rarely are they, you know, as overtly fearful or concerned, you know, as Brian was, and putting it on record. But I guess he really wanted to do his homework first, just to get all his ducks in a row, as we say, before he starts to ask those questions outright of those people who have been implicated, you know, in a murder of sorts. But you know, he finds out relatively early on that there wasn't ever a murder, and it didn't happen the way that John had been saying, which kind of begs the question, why did John contact him? Right. What's he after? What's his motivation, and what's his agenda?
Well, it seems like it was like a kind of an urban legend in the town. It seems like everybody kind of assumed that this happened, and then, you know, it was Brian kind of proved that it hadn't happened, and you know that happens a lot.
Yeah.
But you know, the story goes on, you know, that relationship, like I was just asking somebody else, when do you know a story is over? When do you know a documentary is over? Well, clearly that could have been the end, just finding out, oh, there's nothing here. And yet the relationship continued. And in this way, I think it is very much like Serial. It may not seem like it, but that attachment, you know, from the reporter to the subject, you know, it just keeps growing stronger and stronger. And even though Brian is asking himself, is this guy crazy? Is he, you know, just jerking me around? Is this all a hoax? He still gets deeper and deeper into a relationship with John. So I thought that was interesting.
And the sort of the tattoo parlor side, and just some of the characters that he comes across. And for me, this very, you know, I felt my own personal experience listening, this very thick and heavy level of racism that's hanging in this town, which obviously isn't always easy to characterize when it's, you know, you're doing it on a podcast, for example, versus you're seeing visuals of these individuals. But I think, you know, one of the most powerful lines, you know, that Brian says is basically him saying, you know, that there wasn't a murder, but by the end of the investigation, there would be one.
A nice cliffhanger.
It's a great cliffhanger. I mean, to keep people really hooked in. So, you know, the storytelling aspect of it, I think, is done particularly well, taking us to that point, because now we're wondering, well, what happens? You know, who gets murdered? Is it John, or, you know, what unfolds here?
Right. And the problem is that in this series, Brian is sort of an outsider, and he has to sort of wade through all sorts of different things that are going on. And I think one thing that this series does very well is show you that things are not always as they seem. And your first impression of something or someone can be very different. When somebody comes in from the outside and you're expecting one thing, sometimes that's all you see. And then you can find out that the truth can be something radically different. And
Absolutely.
So the crescendo of the story, the original story, came when actually Brian got a call and he found out that John was no longer alive. And to me, I think he was genuinely hurt by that. Definitely.
Yeah, that was very moving to hear that real-time realization.
He could not just sort of, the person that called him was just sort of rambling on about all these details and all these things. And he's like, wait a minute. I have to catch up to this. Oh my God, I'm still like, I can't believe he's dead. And as it turns out, it appears he took his own life. But even that seems to be questioned a little bit in this, because John, during the course of this podcast, would brag and boast about how he was collecting gold and how he didn't use banks and all his money was hidden, secreted on the property, and he made this maze, and does that have some connection to it? And he told some people that the money was wrapped in a towel in the freezer, or the gold bars were wrapped in a towel in the freezer, and then they were missing, and then he might have buried treasure elsewhere.
Yeah, I think as it started as sort of this murder mystery, I kept going, okay, is this the murder mystery? Was he, is there something more nefarious going on? And I kind of kept waiting for that payoff. And I'm not sure that ever came or if they cared about that. But it was something that I felt not satisfied as I kept listening, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I don't know how you guys felt about that.
Yeah, well, I thought maybe that he was killed, or maybe that there was some crime that happened after he killed himself. And I think that there is certainly a lot of questions left about the property, about the gold, about his fortune. He says he had one. Somehow he was surviving. And he always seemed to have money to pay people. And for example, you mentioned about the tattoos. He outwardly hated tattoos. He talked about them in a very, very negative way all the time. And yet you look at his body, and everywhere T-shirts would be, he's covered in tattoos. Not just little tattoos, but tattoos over tattoos over tattoos.
I've never had a tattoo. You guys have had tattoos?
No.
Is it painful? I mean, it's very painful, right?
Oh, it's absolutely painful.
Particularly if you have your whole back covered, which he did.
John yanks up his shirt and flashes me.
Oh, I wasn't going to show you that abuse.
The entirety of John's chest is tattooed, and his shoulders too, though it's all perfectly covered when he's wearing a t-shirt. The flashing is quick, so I can't take it all in, but I see a glimpse of what's possibly a beaker and maybe a clock-type thing. It takes me aback because John has made clear to me how much he loathes tattoos. They're one of the things he hates about Shittown. I believe he once called them an expression of hopelessness.
And these were just some of the little alarm bells that were ringing for me, as I was writing notes, listening to these little insights from John and these complete contradictions, of saying one thing and yet his behaviour and actions were something completely different.
Right.
And of course, before the announcement of, the phone call, Brian getting the call saying that he had taken his own life, you have the whole insight to Brian being on the phone to him and him peeing in the sink and talking
that
very...
That really affected you.
I know, that did not bother me.
It was gross. It was disgusting.
It is gross.
He's peeing in the sink where food is prepared, where he feeds his mother, and makes food. A, it's incredibly unhygienic, but B, it was his just cavalier attitude about it, almost like he wanted to kind of shock
Well, he
Brian.
didn't have to tell him.
Exactly. So what's he trying to achieve? These are the things for me of these little... question marks that started to become bigger and bigger as we had these further insights about John. And equally, not just John, even for me, about Brian, because once I agree with you, Brian clearly sounded, moved, discombobulated. He was trying to process it. He was in shock. Why was he really in shock, though? Because when we understand the story, John threatened to commit suicide multiple times. He had a letter written, a suicide note, which he'd already shown Brian. Clearly, this was somebody who'd been angling for some time, around suicide. So why would it be a shock to those who he had spoken to many times about it? I can understand those who he hadn't spoken to about it. There's those who take their lives, those who threaten it. And of course, you do get people who threaten it and then take it, and some who never even threaten it and just do it.
Yeah.
But I think these were all interesting things, set in amongst his fixated and, obsessive pursuit of raising awareness around climate change. It wasn't just somebody who was sort of raising the issues. It was somebody who was absolutely fixated that, to me, was projecting and transferring things that we didn't know about, until you kind of go through the whole podcast. But I'd already written down what are his issues, what's underlying all of this, because clearly we haven't got a true understanding of who he is. We've seen surface stuff, but we don't know the detail of
Right.
what's really going on in his life and who he is.
And when you hear the stories about him wanting to get lashed by these branches and blood and whips and self-harming and then all these obsessive piercings and tattoos on his chest and his nipples over and over and over again, clearly this is a man who was obsessed with pain, and he was most likely doing this for the endorphin high that's produced by it. But also, I think he was doing it because he wanted the person who was tattooing him, which is Tyler, he wanted him to be touching him. I think it was a very sexual thing from the beginning. Even before we heard from Michael, I said all his behavior seems to be he wants to be close and alone with this guy Tyler. He's not being a mentor-mentee, but he's turning it into a relationship, and I believe he wanted to be a sexual relationship. And sex, for people, as Laura, you know, it doesn't have to be traditional sexual activity for it to be sexual for somebody. The pain, having someone cause pain to you is a form of sex to certain people. And I believe he was fixated on this, and he basically manipulated Tyler, and we'll later find out that Michael was the same thing, that he manipulated them into situations where he was, I think, getting off on it sexually. I mean, just the perfect example is when Tyler talks about sort of their celebration of Father's Day. He said, well, you know, he's afraid of the water. We went fishing. He's afraid of the water. He wouldn't walk anywhere, wade anywhere without me holding his hand. And he said, hell, we spray painted our names up onto the bridge. I mean, what does that sound like to you?
Sounds like somebody who I'm really sorry for. I mean,
All right,
I know,
but what
I
does it sound like
hear
to you?
what you're saying, but
what,
I felt
I'm
like
asking you a question. What does it
he's in
sound
love
like?
with him.
All right,
He's
and
in love
doesn't it
with
sound
him.
like two teenage kids who
Sure.
are out, you know?
Sure.
He's 47 at the time, and Tyler's 27. So I think, you know, let's really get into the deep dive around him, because again, different interpretation, different perspective. You know, and certainly all the relationships, and I think what John does at times is very carefully crafted and thought through, because the question about, you know, who does he call when he is committing suicide? You know, he calls the town clerk, which I thought was a very interesting thing to do. Why would he call a town clerk and talk Faye and talk her through what he's doing and directing her to do things after he's gone? She was just a big question mark to me.
Yeah.
You know, and also, did she call the people? Did she not? But why would he call her? You know, I just felt that quite a lot of this was stage managed by him to maximum effect, when we understand that he is somebody who really does want to court attention and wants to be famous, wants his name, you know, in bright lights, as it were. You know, is it that he gets to finality with Tyler? And I think, you know, we'll dissect that relationship a lot more. You've just gotten into quite a lot of the key issues under the surface.
All right, great. Well, we have a lot more to talk about in this coverage of S-Town. Some very controversial things coming. Yeah.
All right.
Well, thank you, everybody, for listening to Real Crime Profile.
So if you enjoy our podcast and would like to support us, there are a couple of important things you can do. First, you can go over to iTunes and give us a positive 5-star review. You can check out our sponsors and take advantage of the special promotions for Real Crime Profile listeners. You can go over and like our Facebook page, and you can follow us on Twitter. But most importantly, you can share our podcast with friends, family, and anyone you know would be interested in real crime and the minds that solve those crimes. So thank you for listening.
Real Crime Profile is produced and edited by Paul Francis Sullivan. Sound engineered by Terrell Parham. Music composed by Simba Tsumba. Logo art by Jim Clemente. Real Crime Profile is produced by XG Productions and distributed by Wondery.
For advice and support if you're experiencing stalking in the UK, you can contact Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service on 0203 866 4107, or you can go on the website www.paladinservice.co.uk. If you're experiencing domestic violence, call the National Domestic Violence Helpline, free phone 0800 2000 247. In the US, if you're experiencing domestic abuse and need advice, safety, shelter or counselling, call Genesis, the 24-hour hotline, 214-946-4357, or go on their website www.genesisshelter.org or the domestic violence hotline on 800 799 7233.